In a world increasingly strained by disputes between China and the United States, Brazil manages the feat of making mistakes on both sides at the same time when it comes to foreign policy. On one side, we have people who believe with an almost childlike innocence in a multipolar world as if multipolarity were synonymous with balance, when in practice it means systemic chaos. An increase in instability and extreme vulnerability for medium and small countries like Brazil, which don't have the critical mass to survive in this kind of global disorder. And on the other side, a group mostly made up of people from the right, who have no plan, no pragmatism, and even less strategy, reacting on impulse, acting emotionally, and remaining stuck in outdated views, confusing ideological fanaticism with national goals, leaving the country at the mercy of any minimally organized power. Although the multipolar group may misjudge the international system, they still recognize the essential need to diversify foreign relations. The other group holds a messianic, almost religious view of the United States, believing that for Brazil to match America's success, it wouldn't require imitation but submission. In a pathetic ritual of submission, idolatry, and worship, as if blind obedience to Washington would magically be rewarded in the future with investments, partnerships, and geopolitical benevolence. This geopolitical illiteracy of the Brazilian right also undermines any future chance for a government even minimally aligned with right-wing interests internationally. I say minimally because Brazil lacks a real right wing. It only has a center-left, which is less left-leaning than traditional groups. It also makes the very political survival of this more right-leaning government in power unfeasible. Without an understanding of the international system, without pragmatism, and without a sense of the balance of power, any government is doomed to be short-lived, fragile, and disposable. This geopolitical illiteracy, this disconnection from reality, this lack of international pragmatism, and the fanatical submission with messianic idolatry to Washington form a hard core that defines the Brazilian right today when it comes to foreign policy and geopolitics. This is all fueled by the delusion that the United States in 2020 is the same as in the 1960s and 70s. They are not and never will be again. One thing that the Brazilian right needs to accept is that the United States is not a friend, not a natural ally, and much less a strategic partner of the Brazilian right. They have their own interests, and those interests are geopolitical, not ideological. In other words, they're not our enemies, but they're definitely not friends or allies, and they'll use any resources at their disposal to neutralize competitors, which in some cases includes much of the Brazilian right, just as any major power would do. Therefore, to be very clear and without any romanticism, Brazil has no allies in the international system because it never built its own regional bloc. Maintaining a relationship of submission and idolization with Washington is not realism, it's not pragmatism, and it's certainly not any kind of strategy. It's pure and simple geopolitical self-destruction by the Brazilian right. For each of the reasons I'm going to present in today's video. But before we get to them, don't forget to share the video with everyone you know. To help the World Geopolitics channel keep growing, your support is very important, and that's why if you share, it helps the channel a lot, more than you can imagine. And if you really like the channel, would you consider it? The possibility of becoming a member, thanks to the members, this channel can keep existing, so your support is very important. My name is Geopolitica Mundial, and this is the Geopolitica Mundial channel. Historically, the United States has always abandoned its allies. The United States signed peace agreements in 1973 and withdrew troops from South Vietnam, which resulted in the fall of Saigon in 1975. And it marked the abandonment of the South Vietnamese allies, who, defeated and without American support, were left at the mercy of the Viet Cong troops. The South Vietnamese military officers, public officials, and even South Vietnamese merchants who provided services to the Americans in the following years were re-educated in special camps or later executed. The United States, through the CIA, secretly supported the Kurdish rebellion against the Iraqi regime until 1975, when an agreement was reached between Iran and Iraq. The Algiers Agreement led the United States to cut off that support. And the result was that the Kurdish fighters, then without support, suffered violent repression by Saddam Hussein. However, the Kurds did not learn the lesson, and in 1991, after the Gulf War, the United States encouraged Kurdish and Shiite uprisings in northern Iraq against Saddam Hussein. But they didn't warn them, even though they knew when the regime would brutally suppress the insurgents, including the use of chemical weapons, creating another perception of Kurdish abandonment. But it doesn't stop there, because the Kurds even seem like the Brazilian right wing. After the Iraq War in 2003, they separated again and allied with the United States. Only for, in 2019 in Syria and northern Iraq, the Trump administration to withdraw troops from the region, paving the way for the Turkish offensive, which wiped out several of the Kurdish militias fighting in the region and who also ended up being victims of Al-Qaeda. And in Afghanistan, the United States withdrew after 20 years of war. That chaotic evacuation from Kabul left behind thousands of Afghans who had assisted the American forces during the occupation and who now knew they would be arrested. Images of crowds desperately trying to escape illustrate the sense of betrayal felt by these allies. Official records and historical investigations confirm the recurring pattern of withdrawals that leave used allies exposed to retaliation. For example, 1975 documents from the United States Congress's Pike Committee revealed years of secret support. Henry Kissinger justified before the United States legislature the sudden withdrawal of aid to the Iraqi Kurds in 1975, saying that secret action should not be confused with missionary work, coldly admitting that covert operations followed interests, not moral commitments. The Brazilian right still hasn't learned this about the United States. This statement is part of official testimonies and is often cited as evidence that the United States prioritizes reasons of state over its Kurdish allied states. No remorse for these betrayals, which is no surprise for a great power. And regarding Afghanistan, recent reports and news stories confirm the number of allies left behind. For example, in 2021, approximately 60,000 Afghans who worked as interpreters or administrative staff had special visa applications for the United States because they were at risk of death. After the American withdrawal, testimonies from veterans themselves and United States military officials, published in the press, described the feeling of unfulfilled duty when abandoning the Afghans who served as their partners. So, we have strong evidence from primary sources and reputable analyses, with official records in congressional testimonies, declassified United States government memos, major journalistic investigations, academic studies, and reports from military think tanks. Of course, someone with a skeptical view and idolizing the United States would point out that not all United States allies were abandoned. The United States has long-standing commitments with key partners in Western Europe, Japan, South Korea, Israel, and others. However, Washington's new doctrine regarding NATO makes it clear that the United States will not officially leave NATO, but they will withdraw materially and will shift the responsibility of managing NATO to the Europeans themselves. What has been observed is that there have been repeated concrete cases in which the United States, when they no longer saw strategic advantages, withdrew their support from governments or groups even if they were ideologically aligned with the Americans. This includes the Brazilian right wing, which should be a particular warning for right-wing movements in Brazil, because the implicit lesson is that aligning with the United States does not guarantee support for very long, and in fact, you end up being used as a bargaining chip against the rival group. Because as soon as geopolitical circumstances or American domestic politics change, the support changes as well. The most relevant historical case for Brazil was the American support for the military regime of 1964 and its gradual withdrawal of backing in the 1970s, and the Americans have an excellent tool and argument for their volatility and instability: responsibility and alliances, which is their own democracy. The fact that there is a change of public power in the leadership of the White House exempts new leaders from the responsibilities acquired by previous leaders. They use changes in government to break previous agreements whenever it's convenient, always arguing that it was a mistake made by the previous administration. So, the fact that Donald Trump lifted the sanctions imposed on Alexandre de Moraes through the Magnitsky Act shouldn't surprise or support the Brazilian right in any way. If they had any sense of realism, however, they would not continue in their fanatic idolization and submission to the United States. Part of this is thanks to Olavo de Carvalho. The problem, however, goes beyond the fact that the United States abandons its allies. It's much worse than that because the main exporter of woke fentanyl leftist culture, which is everything the right claims to fight against, but whose Brazilian parliamentarians, who call themselves right-wing, happily embrace in congressional agendas, is the United States. It's an export of American culture and values that theoretically should be seen as contrary to the Brazilian conservative agenda at the same time as Brazil's redemocratization. And globalization intensified through Hollywood, exposing people to liberal Western values. Also the growing influence of international NGOs, many originally American, advocating for human rights that were corrupted to serve as protection for criminals, environmental rights, and identity rights, sometimes clashing with conservative religious and military groups. In Brazil, during the 2010 streaming services like Netflix and social networks heavily promoted American series, movies, and content that highlight homosexual characters, narratives of racial war, especially Afro supremacy, criticism of nationalism and religion, as well as the demonization of hate, white straight man, as being the main one responsible for all the world's evils. And also an encouragement and glorification of drug use, in fact even the sexualization of children. At the same time, American big tech companies face the dilemma of content moderation. Because by fighting fake news and hate speech, they ended up banning and limiting right-wing voices, including the right wing in Brazil, on their platforms, leading to accusations of censorship. Persecution against the right became clear when Elon Musk bought Twitter and exposed its internal documents. And in the 2020s, the Biden administration and American corporations pushed for environmental policies and human rights that differ from the priorities of the Brazilian right, which is more nationalist and values economic sovereignty over the Amazon and traditional values, as well as the discovery that United States Agency for International Development was involved in funding gay parades and promoting freedom and hypersexuality. This clash of agendas reinforces the perception among Brazilian conservative groups of a liberal foreign influence on the direction of the country. However, even with all this documented, publicly known, blatant, and not at all discreet evidence showing that it's the Americans behind these agendas, the Brazilian right continues to see, in the dumbest way possible, that this would be a conspiracy coming from China or Russia. An analysis in Gazeta do Povo notes that American soft power influences culture, activism, and academic ideas and language. In other words, it is recognized that the United States generates and exports cultural content, models of activism, and academic terms that have directly influenced debates in Brazil. This explains why recent Brazilian identity movements have adopted agendas and slogans from the United States, including using English gender-neutral pronouns. For many years, this was said to change only with Donald Trump's administration. The main complaint of right-wing movements in Brazil was the open censorship exercised on social media platforms based in the United States. These United States-originated agendas have influenced Brazil's education and legal systems more than people realize. For example, Brazilian universities imported critical theories and terminologies from universities in the United States, such as gender studies, gender, and race, inspired by the American Academy. A concrete piece of evidence is the proliferation of courses, research, and activist groups that communicate using terms originally in English, such as empowerment, place of speech, and canceling. Documents from the Ford Foundation and Open Society show funding for progressive initiatives in Brazil. Since the 1990s, often bringing consultants and experts from the United States for seminars. Here, in the legal field, several Brazilian jurists reference American jurisprudence and doctrine in matters such as civil rights and freedom of expression. For left-wing agendas, but with censorship of everything associated with the right, and still about United States Agency for International Development in 2024, it disbursed tens of millions of dollars for projects in Brazil, mainly focused on environmental conservation in the Amazon and on indigenous peoples. These organizations include groups like Worldwide Fund for Nature Brazil, the International Institute of Education, the Indigenous Work Center, and others, which have been criticized by the right for interfering in national sovereignty, especially by diluting the influence of the Brazilian state in indigenous lands, hindering key aspects of national security, such as the issue of fertilizer extraction that is on indigenous lands, as well as attacking Brazilian agribusiness. But one of the crucial things is how USAID-funded journalism initiatives known as fact-checking in Brazil, which check right-wing topics claiming they were fake news, even though the vast majority were later confirmed to be real. And still within this export of woke culture and fentanyl, we can't forget about drugs. I have a whole series of videos here on the channel that show, based on documents from the American government itself, how the CIA was continuously involved with drug traffickers here in Brazil for 6 decades. Thanks to Olavo de Carvalho, to the book written precisely by a former CIA agent, the book Red Cocaine, which went viral among the Brazilian right. The right insists that drug trafficking is the result of a Soviet communist conspiracy, when in fact the involvement of Latin American communist militias with drug trafficking only began in the 1980s when the funding from the Soviet Union ended and they then sought other sources of income. Because, let me be very clear, the book Red Cocaine is fake. It doesn't present a single piece of evidence because, according to the author, he couldn't provide that evidence yet since he was still active. But that as soon as he retired, he would show the evidence of Soviet involvement with cocaine. It's been more than 30 years. He retired 2 years after the book was published and never showed such evidence. On the other hand, documents from the United States Senate, administrative inquiries, and court cases from the Americans themselves provide conclusive proof of the CIA's involvement with drug trafficking. Although the degree of their involvement and the documented relationship between the CIA and drug trafficking was never made clear. In the 1970s Southeast Asia Myatina War, investigations found the CIA worked with tribes and militias producing opium. The CIA-owned airline Air America was accused of transporting opioids in Laos to support local allies. And although the CIA denied direct support, it never denied knowing about it or that it tried to do anything about it. On the contrary, they deliberately let the flow of drugs continue because it financed these anti-communist units. And then in the 1980s, the Contra crisis in Nicaragua and cocaine trafficking, because they backed right-wing guerrillas such as the Contras against Nicaragua's Sandinista government. United States government investigations, like the Kerry Committee and the Skinner Report from the United States Senate, documented that members of the Contras and their suppliers were involved in cocaine trafficking to the United States, and that CIA officials were sympathetic to the idea of using drug money to finance the Contras. In 1985, internal United States government reports showed that CIA purchased planes flown by CIA pilots for Contra operations were also being used to smuggle drugs into the United States. And despite warnings and alerts that this was happening, the CIA simply decided not to do anything about it because they were prioritizing the anti-Sandinista objective. Soon after, this intensified in Panama and Colombia as Panamanian General Manuel Noriega, a known drug trafficker, spent years as a CIA informant and ally. Even in the 1980s, Noriega collaborated with United States intelligence even while facilitating cocaine trafficking for the Medellin cartel. Only in 1989, after much pressure from American public opinion and after political disagreements with Noriega, did the United States invade Panama and arrest Noriega. A pattern of support also occurred with the Colombian cartels. In fact, investigations at the time mentioned that even the major Medellin and Cali cartels grew with the indirect support of the CIA. And not directly. Pay close attention, because they weren't directly involved, but they would interfere with the operations of the FBI, the Drug Enforcement Administration, and the Colombian authorities when they were about to carry out an operation against the cartels. In the 1980s, during the Soviet-Afghan War, the CIA funded and armed guerrillas in Jaradim, Afghanistan and Pakistan to fight the Soviets. It turns out that reports indicate that during this period, the region along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border became a major producer of heroin, with accomplices among the local allies. Former CIA directors later admitted that fighting drug trafficking would have interfered with operations to defeat the Soviets. Charles Cogan admitted, saying that there were consequences in terms of drugs. Yes, but our main objective was accomplished. He was the actual CIA chief in the Afghan operation. And in 1996, investigative journalist Gary Webb exposed connections between California cocaine traffickers linked to the Contras and the crack epidemic in the United States. The CIA was indirectly facilitating the entry of cocaine to finance that guerrilla, which led to internal investigations. And in 1998, the CIA Inspector General released reports publicly admitting that the CIA knew about the Contras' involvement with drug trafficking. They failed to properly share this information with Drug Enforcement Administration agencies. And they did it on purpose because this could interfere with anti-guerrilla operations and more recently during the war in Afghanistan. The CIA forbade the United States Army from carrying out operations against heroin producers in Afghanistan because they were allies against the Taliban, as well as ordered the United States Air Force not to carry out attack operations in the drug production areas, so there would be no risk of those plantations being damaged, even knowing that this production was intended for drug trafficking. And again, it's not something that was even kept secret, with several American military officers expressing frustration over the involvement with these traffickers. If Brazil's right-wing movements, which claim to support public security and anti-narcotics, expect consistent United States support, the facts contradict each other. And if you follow the channel, you'll remember the video I made talking about the Brazilian nuclear program, where openly and on several occasions they acted against Brazil. Because there is a consistent, documented pattern of American interference whenever Brazil tried to advance in sensitive areas like the nuclear space program, missiles, supercomputing, and dual-use technologies. Since the 1950s, Washington has been watching with caution any Brazilian move that signals strategic autonomy. Brazil's refusal to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1967 caused concern. A turning point was the Brazil-Germany nuclear agreement in 1975 when declassified United States official documents revealed that Kinzinger, Ford, and Carter pressured Germany to restrict or cancel the transfer of enrichment and reprocessing technologies to Brazil. The same pattern was repeated in the space program since the 1980s, when Brazil began developing its Veículo Lançador de Satélites and consolidating Alcântara as a strategic base. The United States expressed concern about the possible military use of the technologies, especially after Brazil refused to join the missile technology control regime. In 1987, Washington restricted Brazil's access to aerospace components and software, and in the 1990s and 2000s diplomatic cables leaked by WikiLeaks show that the United States acted to limit Brazil-Ukraine cooperation in the Cyclone 4 project, causing Brazil to lose 2 decades in a partnership that was dead on arrival, pressuring Kyiv not to transfer critical knowledge to Brazil. In 2000, the Safeguards Agreement signed by Fernando Henrique Cardoso and Clinton furthered this asymmetry, imposing exclusive areas for Americans at the Alcântara base, also prohibiting Brazilian access to technologies and giving the United States veto power over countries interested in launches from the Alcântara base. Starting in 2019, the new Safeguards Agreement once again enabled commercial launches, but maintained similar limitations. At the same time, American restrictions persisted in sensitive sectors: vetoes on advanced systems in fighter jets, reluctance to release source code, pressure regarding technological partnerships with China, and diplomatic opposition to Brazilian laser enrichment initiatives. Now add to that the episode revealed by Snowden of National Security Agency espionage against Petrobras and agencies in the energy sector, clearly showing the American interest in Brazil's strategic information. In the nuclear case, of course, United States diplomatic files prove without question that there was deliberate action to prevent Brazilian advances in the space field. The documentation proves actions to limit and condition the Brazilian program as a whole. The official records, intelligence reports, and diplomatic leaks show a consistent hostile behavior from the United States against Brazil for more than half a century. And don't forget, as Biden emphasized opposition to the American government. No, I'm not defending Bolsonaro, but showing how the American government, when in doubt, supported the Partido dos Trabalhadores because of environmental issues and the question of human rights. After Lula's victory, the United States was among the first to recognize the result and congratulate Lula, even though the Brazilian right claims this changed after Trump's election. Don't forget that it's precisely this alternation of power in Washington that serves as a shield so that those Americans can support whoever they want. And the same thing applies to the left, but since the left is already suspicious of the United States, they manage to maneuver more efficiently. Regarding this, the Brazilian right needs to evolve and understand that the United States of 2020 is not the United States of 1960. And either the Brazilian right stops submitting itself pathetically and slavishly to the United States, or it will be doomed to failure whenever it gets close to power. We can and should copy the United States in many things that made them into this superpower. But for that, we shouldn't think that they will help Brazil or that they will reward us for shameful submission. There are no friends or allies for Brazil. Brazil has never tried to form its own bloc. That's what the Brazilian right should understand, but I think now it's probably too late. Here's one last detail before we end this video. Today it's a fact that the right, historically here, has relied on the United States as their great allies, their main supporters. In a fanatical and blind idolatry, I repeat, we have to copy them in what made them great powers. But that doesn't mean alignment, an unconditional submission, as has been recurring here on the Brazilian right. The left, even though it doesn't have a great strategy either, has a big advantage over the right. In Brazil, it's the fact that it had much greater, much deeper, more positive and much more varied dialogue around the world. After all, we also have to consider that the Partido dos Trabalhadores government stayed in power much longer than the Bolsonaro government. But in the meantime, they repeatedly spoke with many more world leaders, got closer to many more countries, something the Bolsonaro government did not do. The Bolsonaro government initially demonized China, then targeted Middle Eastern countries. They failed badly when trying to approach the United States and Europe, who rejected them. In other words, right from the start, the only country that actually got closer to Brazil, the one Brazil was interested in getting closer to, was Israel. Other than that, all the other countries pretty much turned their backs on Brazil, even though some tried to get closer. Due to unrealistic ideological and idealistic factors, the Bolsonaro government became isolated. And in this sense, it's important for the right to realize how domestic policy ends up being tied to foreign policy. That's something the left still hasn't realized, but again, because they've been in power longer, they've had more flexibility and a strategy in that sense. They ended up having more friends on the international stage than the right, which, was in power for such a short time, right? I'm not saying Bolsonaro is right-wing, since that's not the literal meaning, but you know what I mean. So in that sense, again, it's important to understand how domestic politics ends up tied to foreign policy when it comes to geopolitics. But the right, from all indications, doesn't want to see, doesn't want to learn. They prefer to demonize China and Middle Eastern countries while unconditionally submitting to the United States. And that's going to come at a very high price. Thank you all, I hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to share this video to help the World Geopolitics channel keep growing. Your support is very important to keep the channel going, because without your support it wouldn't exist. Hugs, and see you in the next video.